Hello. Today we'll talk about the discord and disenchantment between the UK, EU, Ukraine, and USA. Thanks to recent events and meetings and conferences, such as the Munich conferences, where Vice President J.D. Vance made a startling bunch of statements and observations about EU and the state of the world. Now, expectations by the EU, in particular European countries, that the US will back EU's approach of doing little, funding a bit, and then having Ukraine fight the war efforts with minimal skin in the game. These expectations have blown up. US has found several reasons not to backstop the EU and the Ukraine indefinitely in its war with Russia. It might backstop it for a while, but doesn't look like there's a carte blanche. There's no complete backing of the war effort with no properly defined goals in sight. EU has not prepared actually adequately for the changes emanating from the Trump administration. Despite repeated statements by President-elect Trump and J.D. Vance and others in the new administration prior to the elections in the USA, this lack of preparation for Trump 2, has come at a huge cost for EU, not to mention embarrassment. They neither have a well-prepared army or a police force or any kind of attempts to bolster the war effort in terms of men and material. They written a few checks, but a lot was expected from the US to help in the war effort going forward. Now, expecting NATO troops to fight in Ukraine as a last resort was the firm conviction of Europeans, of NATO countries in particular. Now, no longer it looks like a viable option. The Trump admin might be reluctant to put in NATO troops, which boils down to US troops on the ground, boots on the ground. And Trump administration might be reluctant to even venture into that whole process. So, the Trump administration's attempt to set an agenda with President Putin and his Lavrov and others in the Russian administration, while ignoring EU initially, until a framework can be established. So these attempts, meetings in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, without factoring in Ukraine's concerns directly or having them participate, this has caused confusion and agitation not only in Ukraine but in EU. So what might happen is the knee-jerk reactions by EU countries now, by NATO members in Europe, they seem to suggest now that there's an attempt to come up with $700 billion to fund the war effort going forward in the next few years. And then even talk of troops, maybe NATO troops to be positioned there in Ukraine, or even probably come up with French troops or some German troops or Polish troops to take on the war effort to help Ukraine with that. That's not very likely to happen. It seems to be mostly talk at this point. And so, the Trump administration, what could happen from here? Quite a few things could happen, different outcomes. For example, the Trump administration can achieve a fait accompli. They can finish a deal with having direct talks with Russia, with Putin's administration, and then leave EU and Ukraine to deal with the aftermath of that. Let them deal with the outcome, have a deal going. Now, why would they do that? What are the motives is a good question. Again, talks could fail between Putin and Trump's administration, and Trump might just shrug and say, too bad, and then walk away, and then let EU, the European countries, deal with Putin going forward with some kind of help along the way, but nothing really, not taking the lead there. That could be a second option. Now, thirdly, the European countries might jump ahead of Trump administration and start talking directly with Putin. But then it's doubtful if Putin will take them seriously because all these years they were so reluctant to talk to him, and Zelensky was very reluctant to talk to Russia until they attempted to agree to his terms, so to speak. So now, coming back to motivations, why would Trump talk directly with Russia, and then even at the cost of pushing away or not taking EU along or Ukraine along in those direct talks, at least initially, at least so far? Looks like the motivation would be to pry away Russia from the bare embrace of China and North Korea, to separate Russia from those, what might be called the rest of the axis of evil, for lack of a better term, to pry away Russia from the influences of China and North Korea. That could be a motivation, and probably Trump wants to say, take a stab at that. Now, as for EU, they want to continue to use the USA as a backstop, and NATO to help with the security challenges, this nightmare with Russia on the border. As for Ukraine, what are the motivations going forward? To recover as much land as possible, as much land back as possible, continue with the war of attrition with China, hoping NATO will jump in at some point and things get really bad, but then more of the same for a while and keep them at Russia at bay, so to speak. Now, what motivations would Russia have? Well, they want to minimize their losses, so maybe they want to make a deal at this point, declare victory, and get salvage some respect for Putin and his administration and his warmongering, and then hang on to some of the regions and Donbass or whatever it is, some eastern Ukrainian land that they've grabbed so far, and then to Crimea, hang on to them for a bit longer. That could be motivation, declare victory and go home. President Trump would like to declare victory and go home and say, hey, I got a great deal going. And then, of course, the baby will be left with the so-called, the whatever leftover Ukraine and the Russian threat would be left for Europeans to deal with. So this could be the net outcome, but it'd be interesting to see how all of these different players handle the situation, not to mention how China would be watching on the sidelines and see which way it's going, and the rest of the world watching this, what might call tamasha, or this big drama, this unfolding. They would be the silent spectators of a grand deal or a grand debacle. Interesting times indeed.